It's hard to believe, but for the first years of World War II, America's night fighters were a laughingstock. The reason why they failed, and how they suddenly dominated the dark, is a story of forgotten technology. German pilots owned the night skies over Europe, and our early attempts to stop them were clumsy, dangerous failures. But the Axis overlooked one American invention that would change night combat forever. Why did the Luftwaffe and Japanese pilots openly mock American night fighters? Because our planes were flying blind. That is, until the P-61 Black Widow arrived with a secret weapon that would shift the balance of the war in the dark. In the long, dark history of human conflict, the night was always a veil, a place to hide, to move, to regroup. But in the 1930s, a new, terrible doctrine emerged, one championed by men like Stanley Baldwin, who famously declared in 1932, "The bomber will always get through." And he was right. When the Second World War ignited, the night was no longer a shield. It became a highway for terror. The world learned this lesson in Fire and Thunder, beginning on the 7th of September 1940. The German Luftwaffe, having failed to break the Royal Air Force by day, turned its fury on London. The Blitz began. For 57 consecutive nights, and then off and on for months, the bombers came. The wail of the Wailing Winnie sirens, the drone of hundreds of Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s, the crump of high explosives. It was a new kind of warfare, aimed not just at factories, but at the very will of a people. But the British, with their backs to the wall, were learning. They were innovating at a desperate pace. They had radar, chain home, but it was a clumsy tool. It could tell them bombers were coming, but not precisely where. The real work fell to the brave few of the RAF's night fighter squadrons. These were men flying Bristol Blenheims and later the heavy-hitting Bristol Beaufighter. They were guided by primitive on-board airborne interception radar, the AI Mark IV. The operator in the back would stare at a green scope, interpreting ghostly blips to guide his pilot through a black ocean, hunting a killer he could not see. These British pilots, men like John Cat's Eyes Cunningham, became aces in the dark. They invented the tactics, writing the book on night combat page by page, often in their own blood. They were desperate, they were brilliant, and they were, for a time, alone. Because on the other side of the Atlantic, America was still a slumbering giant, convinced that the war, if it came, would be fought in the daylight by vast armadas of B-17 flying fortresses. We were, in a word, unprepared for the dark. When the inevitable happened on December 7th, 1941, America was thrust into a global war on two fronts, and we were suddenly faced with a terrifying reality. We had no effective night fighter. Not one. The Axis powers, particularly Germany, had spent years perfecting the art of night operations. The Japanese, too, proved adept at using the darkness for disruptive, morale-sapping raids. And the United States Army Air Forces had nothing. This was the core of the problem. This is why the Axis scoffed. They looked at America's first fumbling attempts to fight in the dark, and they saw amateurism. They saw desperation. And they were, for a time, absolutely correct. Our first solution was a classic example of wartime expediency. It was a stopgap. It was a patch. It was called the Douglas P-70. On paper, it seemed logical. The A-20 Havoc was a fast, modern, twin-engine attack bomber. The Army figured, why not stick a radar in the nose, paint it black, and call it a night fighter? But it was a disaster. The conversion was clumsy. The radar they installed, the SCR-540, was a direct copy of the British AI Mark IV, and it was already verging on obsolete. It was a bulky, unreliable piece of equipment that gave the operator a vague blip, but had a massive blind spot. It couldn't see anything closer than about 500 feet. So the operator would guide the pilot toward a ghost, and then, at the last second, the ghost would vanish. The pilot was left to squint into the blackness, hoping to catch a glimpse of an exhaust flare before he collided with his target.
The P-70 itself was a poor platform. It was sluggish, a flying truck as many pilots called it, robbed of the A-20's agility by the weight of the radar and the heavy 4-pack of 20mm cannons bolted onto its belly. Visibility from the cockpit was notoriously poor. It was, in short, a compromise. And in the lethal mathematics of air combat, a compromise is just another word for a coffin. German pilots, when they rarely encountered these machines, found them slow and easy to evade. Japanese pilots in the Pacific, flying nimble washing machine Charlie bombers over Guadalcanal, flew circles around them. The P-70 crews were brave, but they were sent on a fool's errand. They were trying to hunt wolves with a musket, while the wolves were armed with rifles. And the Germans, they had more than rifles. They had a fortress. To understand why the Luftwaffe was so confident, you have to understand the Kammhuber line. This was the brainchild of General Josef Kammhuber. It wasn't just a line of planes, it was a deeply integrated, brilliantly conceived system of air defense. It stretched from Denmark down to the south of France. Imagine the sky over Germany divided into a grid of invisible boxes, each about 20 miles wide and 30 miles deep. Each box, called a Himmelbett, or four-poster bed, was a self-contained killing zone. At the heart of each box was a team of radars. A long-range Freya radar would detect the incoming British bomber stream from hundreds of miles away. As a bomber entered the box, 2 Würzburg tracking radars would lock on. One tracked the bomber, the other tracked the German night fighter assigned to that box, typically a Messerschmitt Bf 110 or a Junkers 88. In a darkened bunker on the ground, a controller would watch these 2 plots, 2 little dots of light, creep across his map. He was the choreographer of a deadly ballet. Over the radio, he would give the fighter pilot a constant stream of vectors. Turn left, heading 350, target 5 miles, 2,000 feet above you, closing. The German pilot never had to search. He was an arrow, aimed directly at his target by an unseen hand. Once he was close, his own radar operator, using the onboard Liechtenstein radar, would take over for the final intercept. And the Germans had another horrifying trick up their sleeve. It was called Schräge Musik, or slanted music. This was a pair of autocannons mounted in the fuselage of the fighter, angled to fire upward at about a 70-degree angle. The German pilot didn't even have to get behind the bomber. He would simply slide in underneath it, into the bomber's total blind spot. The British gunners in their turrets above and behind would see nothing. The German pilot would match the speed of the bomber, look up through his gun sight, and pull the trigger. A stream of 20 or 30mm cannon shells would rip through the bomber's belly, often igniting the fuel tanks in the wings. For the crew of the Lancaster or Halifax, there was no warning, just a sudden, catastrophic explosion. This was the system the Axis had. It was industrial, it was efficient, and it was deadly. And it was this system that looked at the fumbling American P-70s and scoffed. The problem was just as bad in the Pacific. On Guadalcanal, our brave Marines were clinging to a tiny, precious airfield called Henderson Field. Every night, like clockwork, the Japanese would send over a handful of bombers. They weren't trying to win the war in one go. They were trying to break the Americans. These planes, nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie for their out-of-sync engines, would drone overhead for hours, dropping a single bomb here, a single bomb there. They denied the exhausted Marines sleep. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. The Marines in their foxholes would fire machine guns uselessly into the sky, cursing in frustration. The P-70s based at Henderson Field were all but useless against the high-altitude, nimble raiders. The night in every theater of the war belonged to the enemy. We were losing the war in the dark. So, to summarize the problem, the Axis scoffed because our technology was inferior. Our doctrine was non-existent, our first planes were clumsy converted bombers, and our enemies, on the other hand, were masters of the dark with integrated systems, specialized aircraft, and tactics that were years ahead of our own. This was the crisis, and a crisis of this magnitude demands more than a compromise. It demands a revolution. If you remember the stories of that air war, or perhaps you had a father or an uncle who served in the Army Air Forces, this next part of the story will show you just how desperate and how brilliant the engineers back home had to be. Let us know in the comments if you or a family member had any connection to that great air war. We read every one, and it helps us keep these memories alive. The revolution began not in a factory, but on a boat. In 1940, with Britain facing invasion, Winston Churchill made one of the most important decisions of the war. He ordered a team of scientists, led by Sir Henry Tizard, to sail to America. Their mission: give the Americans all of Britain's scientific secrets, in the desperate hope that the neutral giant would turn them into weapons of war. In a black box, they carried the plans for radar, for jet engines, and most importantly, for a small, simple device called the cavity magneton. This one device was the key. It was a high-power microwave transmitter, small enough to fit in the nose of an airplane, that could generate a radar beam so fine and so precise that it could see not just a blip, but the shape of a target. It was a quantum leap. This device would become the heart of the new American SCR-720. But a radar needs a home. Even before the Tizard mission, the U.S. Army Air Corps, spurred on by the British, had put out a request for a new kind of airplane, a dedicated night fighter. The specifications were brutal. It had to have a long loiter time, meaning it could stay airborne for hours hunting. It needed to be a stable platform for the new sensitive radar. It needed overwhelming firepower, enough to destroy a heavy bomber in a single 3-second burst. And it had to carry a crew of 3, a pilot to fly, and 2 specialists to operate the complex radar and guns. Several companies submitted designs, but one stood out for its sheer audacity. It came from a man named Jack Northrop. Jack Northrop was a California visionary, a man who dreamed of sleek, futuristic flying wings. His ideas were often considered too advanced for their time, but for this challenge, his radical thinking was exactly what was needed. His proposal, the XP-61, was unlike anything the world had ever seen.
It was a beast. A monster of an airplane, the largest production fighter the U.S. would build in the entire war. To get the performance and stability needed, Northrop and his team returned to a design they knew well, the twin-boom layout, much like the P-38 Lightning. This allowed the central fuselage, or gondola, to be packed with the crew, the guns, and the radar, without having to route everything around a massive engine in the nose. And that nose was special. It was made of plastic, not metal, so the new SCR-720 radar, the productionized cavity magnetron, could scan the sky ahead untouched by interference. This radar was the plane's entire reason for being. It was so advanced, it could spot a bomber from 5 miles away and guide the pilot in, all the way down to a range of just a few hundred feet. The blind spot of the old P-70 was gone. But finding the enemy was only half the problem. You had to destroy him. Northrop's solution was overwhelming, brutal force. He didn't just give the P-61 guns. He gave it an arsenal. Slung under the belly were 4 20mm cannons. This placement was genius. Unlike wing-mounted guns, which had to be harmonized to converge at a single point in front of the plane, these cannons fired straight ahead. The pilot was aiming a massive 20mm shotgun. At 300 yards, the spread of cannon shells was so dense that a pilot simply had to get the nose pointed in the general direction of the enemy and pull the trigger. The target would be shredded. As if that wasn't enough, many P-61s were also fitted with a revolutionary remote-controlled turret on top of the fuselage, holding 4 .50 caliber machine guns. This turret could be aimed either by the pilot or a dedicated gunner in the back, allowing the plane to attack targets that weren't even in front of it. This was a plane built for one purpose: to hunt in the dark and kill with absolute certainty. But as with any revolutionary design, there were problems. The P-61 was staggeringly heavy. With a full load of fuel and ammunition, it weighed over 30,000 pounds. Critics in the Air Corps, men still thinking in terms of light, agile, daylight dogfighters, called it a flying truck. They claimed it would be too slow, too clumsy to ever catch a nimble German or Japanese bomber. But Jack Northrop had another trick up his sleeve. Instead of traditional ailerons for roll control, the P-61 used a set of spoilers or flaps that popped up from the top of the wing. This radical design, called spoilerons, gave the massive plane an incredible, almost delicate agility. On its first test flights, pilots were stunned. The flying truck could turn on a dime. It could outmaneuver planes half its size. And then there was the paint. It was painted matte black, top to bottom. This has become its most iconic feature, but the reason for it is one of the most misunderstood parts of its story. It wasn't for camouflage. In the vast black emptiness of the night sky, a black plane is actually more visible than a light-colored one, silhouetted against the stars. No, the real reason was for the pilot. The black paint was designed to prevent any stray glint of moonlight or the glare from his own instrument panel from ruining his precious night vision. So by 1944, the P-61 Black Widow was finally entering service. It was a marvel of engineering. It had the world's best radar. It had firepower that could tear a locomotive in half. It had surprising agility and a long, long reach. But there was still one single massive flaw, a problem that even with all this technology, the Axis pilots still had the advantage. The plane was stable. The radar found the target. The pilot would line up for the kill, his eyes straining, his radar operator calling out the range. But the enemy pilot wasn't just going to fly straight and level. He would bank, he would turn, he would dive. And this created the single greatest challenge of aerial gunnery, the deflection shot. Think of it this way. If you're a duck hunter, you don't aim at the duck, you aim in front of it. You lead the target, so the duck and your shotgun pellets arrive at the same point in space at the same time. This is called deflection. Now, imagine doing that not with a shotgun, but with 20mm cannons. Your target isn't a duck, it's a Messerschmitt, flying at 300 miles per hour, and you are not standing still. You are also flying at 300 miles per hour, in the dark, in a high G turn, with no horizon to tell you which way is up. It was an impossible math problem. The pilot had to instantly, instinctively calculate his own speed, his own rate of turn, the enemy's speed, his angle, the bullet's travel time, and the bullet's drop by gravity, all in the space of about 2 seconds. They were guessing. They were walking the rudder and hosing the sky with cannon shells, praying for a hit. More often than not, they missed. The enemy pilot would dive away, warned by the stream of tracers, and be gone forever. The P-61 was an incredible machine, but it was still just a machine. The pilots were still just men, and the problem of deflection was too much for a man to solve alone. The Axis pilots were simply better at this instinctive, deadly geometry. The scoffing continued, because even with our new wonder weapon, we still couldn't land the killing blow. America didn't just need a better plane, it needed a better brain. The solution, like the radar, had its roots in a different field of warfare. For years, the Sperry Corporation had been the world's leader in one particular, almost magical piece of technology, the gyroscope. For this audience, many of you know what a gyroscope is. You've seen them in old naval compasses, or perhaps in stabilizers that kept ships from rolling in heavy seas. A gyroscope, at its heart, is a spinning wheel. And thanks to a principle called gyroscopic precession, that spinning wheel wants to stay pointed in the same direction. It resists motion. It holds its place in space. Sperry had used this principle to build the famous Norden bomb sight. The bomb sight used a gyroscope to keep its crosshairs stable, allowing a bombardier to fly the B-17 on its final run with incredible precision. But that was for dropping bombs on a stationary target. What about shooting at a moving one? The problem fell to a brilliant eccentric professor at MIT named Dr. Charles Stark Draper. Draper, who would one day be known as the father of inertial navigation and help guide the Apollo astronauts to the moon, was obsessed with gyroscopes. He believed they could do more than just stabilize. He believed they could calculate. This led to the creation of the K-series gunsight built by General Electric and Sperry. It was, in essence, an analog computer. It was a brain in a box, and it was pure mechanical genius. Here is how it worked. It was breathtakingly simple for the pilot, but infinitely complex inside. The pilot had to give the sight two pieces of information. First, what was his target? He would dial in the wingspan of the enemy plane, say 56 feet for a Junkers 88. This told the sight the size of the thing it was looking at. Second, where was the target? The pilot would use his controls to place a small glowing dot, or pipper, directly on the enemy aircraft. He didn't have to lead it, he just had to keep the dot on the target. That's all the pilot did. The gunsight did the rest. By keeping the dot on the target, the pilot was also moving his entire P-61. As the P-61 turned, the gyroscopes inside the sight felt that rate of turn. They precessed. And this mechanical motion, fed through an intricate, beautiful series of gears and cams, was combined with the range information. The sight knew the target's wingspan, and as the pilot got closer, the target's image would grow larger. The pilot would adjust the sight to keep the reticle on the wingtips, and this told the sight the distance to the target. So the sight knew the rate of turn, and it knew the distance. With those two variables, its internal computer instantly solved the impossible deflection equation. And here's the magic. The pipper, the glowing dot, that the pilot was using to aim, was not where the guns were pointed. The gunsight was moving the pipper. It was projecting the pipper onto the glass, showing the pilot not where the target was, but where he needed to fly his airplane to place the bullets on the target. The pilot no longer had to guess. He no longer had to be a mathematician. He just had to be a good flyer. He just had to put the dot on the target and squeeze the trigger. The gunsight, this mechanical fortune teller, had already predicted the future. This was the final piece of the puzzle. This was the weapon that would, at last, wipe the scoffing grin off the faces of the Axis pilots. The new gunsights were rushed to the front lines, installed in P-61s, P-51s, and P-47s. In Europe, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron was one of the first to get the new P-61s equipped with this brain.
The results were immediate and horrifying for the Germans. Luftwaffe pilots, flying their U-88s or Messerschmitt 410s, were used to the clumsy American attacks. They'd see the tracers, pull a simple defensive brake, and the American plane would wallow past, its shots spraying harmlessly into the dark. But now, something was different. The Americans were coming in fast. The German pilot would bank, and the P-61 would bank with him, as if they were tied together. And then on the very first pass, in the middle of a high G turn, the Black Widow would light up, and a stream of 20mm shells would tear their plane apart. Luftwaffe crews who survived these encounters were baffled. They reported to their intelligence officers that the Americans must have a new death ray, some kind of beam that was impossible to dodge. They couldn't comprehend that we had created a machine that could think. One American P-61 pilot, Hermann Ernst, described it with chilling simplicity. "I just put the dot on him," he said, squeezed the trigger, and he fell apart. There was no more guesswork, no more hosing, just cold, calculated, mechanical precision. The era of scoffing was over. This kind of technological leap is fascinating, and it's a theme we cover all the time here. This combination of grit, engineering, and sheer ingenuity defined that generation. If this is the kind of detailed history you appreciate, hitting that subscribe button is the best way to ensure you won't miss our next deep dive into the machines and the men who changed the world. With this new lethal combination, the tables turned completely. The P-61 Black Widow, once the underdog, became the most feared predator in the night sky. Its service record speaks for itself. Over Europe, the P-61s of the 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons became the ultimate defense against one of Hitler's last desperate terror weapons, the V-1 Buzz Bomb. These were small, fast pulse-jet-powered cruise missiles aimed at London. They were too fast for many day fighters and too small for anti-aircraft guns to hit reliably. But they were perfect targets for the P-61. The Black Widows would hunt them in the dark over the English Channel. The Gyro gunsight made hitting them almost trivial. In fact, the P-61s were so effective and their 20mm cannons so powerful that pilots were ordered not to shoot them at close range. The explosion from the V-1's 1-ton warhead was big enough to destroy the P-61 that had just killed it. This led to one of the most incredible tactics of the air war. P-61 pilots would fly up alongside the V-1, slide their wingtip just under the V-1's small wing, and then gently roll. The disturbed air, the wake, would tip the V-1's wing, toppling its primitive gyroscope and send the buzz bomb spiraling harmlessly into the sea. This required a level of flying skill and stability that was, at the time, almost unimaginable. The P-61 was just that good. Later, during the Battle of the Bulge, the P-61s took on a new, devastating role. The German Army's last great offensive relied on moving troops and tanks at night, hidden from the swarms of Allied P-47s and Typhoons. The Black Widows were unleashed. They became nighttime attack aircraft, strafing German supply columns, hunting tanks, and destroying trains. They created a new kind of hell for the Wehrmacht, proving that now not even the dark could protect them. The story was the same in the Pacific. When the P-61s finally arrived in force, the reign of Washing Machine Charlie and the Japanese Night Raiders came to an abrupt end. Japanese pilots who relied on the incredible agility of their Ki-45 Nick fighters suddenly found that agility was useless. It didn't matter how hard they turned. The American brain in a box turned faster. The P-61s simply could not miss. So let's return to that original question. Why did the Axis scoff? They scoffed because they were arrogant, yes, but their arrogance was earned. They were professionals. They had mastered the dark with superior tactics and a superior system. They looked at America's first effort, the P-70, and saw exactly what it was, a clumsy, desperate, amateurish attempt to copy what they had already perfected. But they made a fatal mistake. They mistook a stopgap for our final answer. They underestimated the sheer industrial and intellectual power of the United States. They stopped scoffing when America didn't just copy their system, but created a new one. A system that combined a dedicated, purpose-built airframe in the P-61, a revolutionary high-resolution radar in the CR-720, and most critically, an analog computer that could think, the Gyro Gunsight. The Black Widow's career was, in the end, relatively short. By 1945, the jet age was dawning. The Messerschmitt 2062, the Gloucester Meteor, and our own P-80 Shooting Star were proving that the piston engine's time was at an end. The P-61 was the absolute pinnacle, the final and greatest expression of the propeller-driven night fighter. But its legacy and the legacy of that gunsight was profound. It proved that the future of warfare would not be won simply by braver men or faster planes. It would be won by information. It would be won by machines that could process the battlefield and give their operators an answer faster than the enemy. The line from that spinning gyroscope in a P-61 to the inertial navigation that took Neil Armstrong to the moon and the head-up display in a modern F-22 is direct and unbroken. It all started in the dark, over a threatened Europe, with a brain in a box that for the first time gave us the power to own the night.
The story of the P-61 is a remarkable one, but it's just one of many. We've actually made a full, detailed video on the P-61's incredible cousin, the P-38 Lightning, which you can watch by clicking the box right here on the screen. If you enjoyed this, we're glad to have you. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for lending us your time today.